The escalation that many analysts feared may already be beginning. In the last 24 hours, Iran has reportedly expanded its list of targets beyond purely military sites. Iranian state-linked sources and affiliated media have warned that major American technology companies, including Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, could become legitimate targets if the conflict continues to widen. Iranian messaging has framed these firms as part of what it describes as the digital infrastructure supporting Western military and intelligence operations. Wired 1, the warning goes even further. Offices, cloud infrastructure, and data centers connected to major Western tech firms across Israel and parts of the Gulf have been named in Iranian media as potential targets. That threat follows earlier strikes and incidents involving commercial infrastructure. In recent days, attacks linked to the conflict have already damaged data centers and other civilian economic facilities across the region, highlighting how modern warfare increasingly targets the digital backbone of the global economy. Financial markets are also being pulled directly into the confrontation. Iranian messaging channels have suggested that economic institutions, including financial exchanges and banking networks connected to Israel, could be considered part of the battlefield if the war continues to expand. At the same time, political developments in Israel have added another layer of uncertainty. After days largely absent from public view, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reappeared on the political stage following a prolonged hiatus. His return comes at a moment when Israeli leadership is under intense pressure to respond to Iranian retaliation, while also managing the risk of further regional escalation. These developments are occurring against the backdrop of a rapidly expanding regional conflict that began on February 28 with coordinated strikes by the United States and Israel on Iranian targets. The attacks triggered a cascade of retaliatory missile and drone strikes across the region and sparked what is now widely referred to as the Seize 2026 Iran War. Wikipedia 4. But behind the headlines and missile exchanges, a different conversation may already be unfolding quietly through diplomatic back channels. There is a negotiation taking place that few officials in Washington are willing to discuss publicly. It is not about uranium enrichment levels or ballistic missile development or the status of Iran's underground nuclear facilities. Those discussions effectively ended when the first bombs fell. What is being discussed now, quietly through intermediaries and Gulf capitals, is something far more consequential. The question is whether the United States military presence in the Middle East could eventually come to an end. Iran's position in potential ceasefire talks has been stated with unusual clarity by officials including Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Tehran's condition for ending hostilities, according to multiple diplomatic sources, is that the United States dismantle its regional military infrastructure. That would mean removing bases across Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. The network that has defined American power projection in the Gulf for more than 70 years. The surprising development is that versions of this idea are reportedly being discussed. Two possible frameworks have circulated in diplomatic conversations. The first would involve a temporary withdrawal. American forces leaving certain bases on a defined timeline measured in months. Washington could frame such a move as a strategic repositioning rather than a retreat. The second scenario is more dramatic, a permanent departure accompanied by an internationally guaranteed timeline, potentially overseen by outside mediators. The very existence of such discussions illustrates how dramatically the strategic environment has changed since the conflict began. When the war started, American planners entered the confrontation with several assumptions. They believed that overwhelming U.S. air power would quickly degrade Iran's military capacity. They also expected that internal political instability might weaken the Iranian government. Another assumption was that the Strait of Hormuz would remain open. Few strategists believed Iran would risk disrupting one of the world's most important oil routes while fighting the United States. Finally, there was confidence that American missile defense systems, Patriot batteries, naval interceptors, and the THAAD AAD would effectively shield U.S. bases and allied capitals from retaliation. Those assumptions are now being tested. One of the most urgent concerns emerging behind closed doors reportedly involves the rate at which missile defense interceptors are being consumed. Defensive systems designed to counter ballistic missiles and drones are being fired at rates far higher than anticipated in pre-war planning. Each interceptor costs millions of dollars, while many of the missiles and drones they destroy cost far less to manufacture. Over time, that imbalance creates a logistical and economic challenge even for the world's most powerful military. To reinforce defenses in the Middle East, the United States has begun repositioning missile defense assets from other regions. Among the most controversial decisions has been the redeployment of THAAD batteries previously stationed in South Korea. Officials in Seoul have reportedly expressed concern about losing part of their missile defense umbrella, which plays a critical role in deterring threats from North Korea. Despite those concerns, some systems have been redirected toward the Middle East to help counter Iranian missile attacks. The redistribution of military assets illustrates how global the conflict has already become. Systems originally deployed to defend East Asia are now being moved thousands of kilometers away to sustain operations in another theater. Meanwhile, Iranian leaders are framing the war as a contest of endurance. Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf has declared that Iran will continue the fight until the United States seeks a ceasefire. Iranian officials argue that early expectations of a quick victory have already proven unrealistic. Instead, the war is becoming a test of logistics, economics, and political will. The imbalance between the cost of offensive weapons and defensive interceptors underscores that dynamic. A relatively inexpensive missile can force the defender to expend extremely costly interceptors to stop it. Repeated hundreds of times, that exchange gradually drains stockpiles. At the same time, governments across the Gulf are reassessing their own strategic positions. Many host American bases, but were reluctant participants in the conflict. As missile and drone strikes ripple across the region, leaders in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates are quietly reconsidering the long-term structure of their security relationships. The question facing them is simple but profound. If the American security umbrella becomes uncertain, what alternatives exist? Analysts increasingly point to a diversification of alliances. Countries like China have expanded diplomatic engagement in the region and have positioned themselves as potential mediators and economic partners. No Gulf government is likely to publicly pivot away from Washington during an active war, but the strategic calculations underlying those alliances are shifting in real time. The implications extend far beyond the Middle East. Allies in East Asia, including Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, rely heavily on the credibility of American security commitments. If the United States were perceived as stepping back from a long-standing regional military presence under pressure, governments elsewhere would inevitably reconsider their own assumptions. Security guarantees depend not only on military strength but also on confidence that those commitments will hold even when the costs become high. The economic implications are equally significant. Energy markets depend on the stability of Gulf export routes. For decades, the presence of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet in Bahrain has served as a key stabilizing force for the global oil trade. If that security framework were suddenly called into question, oil markets would react immediately. Shipping insurance, transportation routes, and long-term energy contracts would all have to be recalculated. For Iran, the outcome of the conflict would also reshape its regional position. Surviving a prolonged confrontation while forcing negotiations over the future of U.S. bases would dramatically increase Tehran's influence across the network of allied groups operating throughout the region. Meanwhile, other actors are watching closely. Groups aligned with Iran, including the Houthis in Yemen, could widen the conflict if they believe doing so might accelerate an American withdrawal. That possibility would place additional pressure on another key maritime choke point, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, linking the Red Sea to global shipping routes. If both the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb became contested simultaneously, the consequences for global trade would be severe. Energy prices could surge dramatically, and supply chains that depend on those maritime corridors could face disruptions on a scale not seen in decades. What began as a military campaign has therefore evolved into something far larger, a geopolitical test of endurance, alliances, and credibility. The real question now being discussed quietly in diplomatic channels is not simply how the war ends, it is what the world looks like the day after. Will the United States manage a controlled strategic repositioning, or will events force a more abrupt departure? And once that decision is made, the consequences will extend far beyond the Middle East, shaping alliances, markets, and the balance of global power for decades to come.